Hello, in today's video, I'll be showing you how you can use Slack's Modal functionalities to create forms with complex field validations. This will be an advanced session where I'll be breezing through the initial commands setup, so if you find yourself lost at any part, do take a pause to read up more on the basic functionalities of Workbot first. I'll leave a link to the docs below. Alternatively, you can also watch my previous video which explains more on how to use buttons and blockkits. Alright. So for this demo, the use case is to allow users to invoke a bot command to expense a cash transaction via a form. Let's sketch this out so we have something to refer to. Over here, this is my command for creating a new expense. This will allow a user to invoke the form. And what the form fields will consist of, I'll have three fields. First of all, the description of the expense itself. And the validation for this field is that it needs to actually contain at least 5 characters. Then followed by the expense amount, which can either be an integer or a float, and that value has to be greater than 0. Finally, you also have to put in a date for your expense, and our validation for this portion is going to be date having to be greater than or equals to first day of the last month. To also further improve the user experience, these are the requirements that we would like to actually put in as well. First of all, we have to surface all input errors to the user upon the submission of the form instead of surfacing them one by one. Secondly, we also don't want the user to refill the entire form if one of the fields is invalid. So let's take a look at how we can implement this by going into Workato. First of all, I'm going to start with a new folder. And go ahead and create that. And we'll go ahead and create our first recipe for this. Just going to skip through the recipe editor. Let's come into the portion over here. First of all, I'll put in create new expense as my bot command. So that's going to be over here in the title. Create expense. And for the trigger, just going to choose Workbot. Going to be my new command. Link my account up to the bot that I have. And I'm going to customize these three fields accordingly. Enter a custom value. First one for create, second one for new, and the third one for expense. How we can get started. I also have to put in a command hint. Say create. Right, so that's all we need for now for the trigger at list. So I'm just going to minimize this portion. Let's come in to actually design our first action. For my form fields, I know that I want to actually open this up in a modal. So let's go into Workato, selecting my actions, again choosing Workbot, and choosing Modal. Right. This is where I would like to actually open a modal view. So I'll come in here. Let's take a look at what the hint provides us with. Right. To actually open a modal view, what we'll need to see is we need to actually provide a valid trigger ID. This trigger ID can be found in the new command data tree. I'm just going to actually remove these suggestions just because I like to map this accordingly by myself. Modal action, let's do open. Trigger ID, here's one that I could potentially use, and let's see where this comes from. If I go over and click on it on the right, you can see that's coming from my trigger and then under my context. So that's where I would like to get the trigger ID. However, over here you'll see that trigger ID only comes from interactive components. So let's take a look at what these mean. So coming into Slack, let's see what interactive components are. Essentially, by clicking on any of these items itself, it's going to give me a trigger ID that allows me to open a modal. Where I wouldn't get a trigger ID is if I type to the bot create new expense, this constitutes a text message, which is not going to provide me with an ID. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to surface a button first back to the user so that he or she can click on that, thus giving me a trigger ID itself. So we're going to do that by just going up here, and we're just going to say, let's use an if-else condition, putting it as the first action. And what I'm going to do is a couple of recursive techniques for bot commands. Whenever the user actually puts this as my text command, if the trigger ID doesn't appear, we are going to actually populate the message with a button. We're just going to put that here. If trigger ID is not present, first of all, I'm going to say my first action over here is to post a command reply, again removing these suggestions. What I just want to do in this section is go ahead to give the user a button. So let's put this as create new expense or create expense. Maybe let's just give it an emoji for fun. Let me say if I go ahead and look for one. Okay, let's use the money back emoji. Just copy this. Paste this over here. Right. And what I want to do for the submit button command is that I actually want it to recurse and come back into this same recipe. So instead of choosing from the list of other recipes over here, what I'm going to be doing is to enter a custom value instead. And I'm going to actually provide it with a recipe ID. Now to get this recipe ID, what I can do is I can either copy it from here, or this field, if it changes often if I'm moving around different recipes, then this is probably where I want to choose from the properties section instead. The recipe ID is one data field that I can use as well. So what this does is it will create that button, and if I click on that, it's going to come back into this recipe again. And the reason why we are going to perform this is so that we can get the trigger ID that we can use later on to open our modal view. Over here, just going to add a couple of comments so that the actions later on don't leave us confused. So over here, I'm going to say that if it's not present, give user a button, click generate trigger ID. Right. So if that is present, then what we'll be doing instead is to open the modal view. And let's see, we can continue with this section over here. For modals, the things that we can actually compose are the blocks. I'm just going to actually set that up over here. For our title, I'm just going to say create an expense. And I'm going to add several blocks in here. The first of which is my first view. So that's my description of my expense. I'm just going to give it over here. Let's use a multi-line input, right? This is where a user can type in as long descriptions as he wants. The label for this is description of your expense. And then just going to set the other configurations as well. This is not an optional field. Set that to no. The parameter name itself, this one is, I'll just leave it as description. And then there are a couple of other sort of validations that Slack allows you to do inside of the dialog field. And minimum length and maximum length are some of that. In our case, we have this as our requirement. It has to contain at least 5 characters. I'm just going to put that in this portion here. Minimum length is 5. Right, so that's our first block. Let me go ahead and minimize that. Let's go ahead and add the 2 other blocks for the other fields as well. We have amount. This time round, we probably just have to stick with a single line. Then I'm just going to give amount expense as my label. Again, this is not an optional field. Parameter name, we'll just keep it as amount. And I'll just leave the rest as it is. What you see at the bottom is this time round for validation, we still only have the option to choose between minimum length and maximum length. If for some reason a user decides to put in perhaps some other value as the amount, we're not going to be able to validate that with options that we see over here. So we'll explore how we can validate those later. For now, I'll just minimize this block again, and we'll create our third block for the date. I'm going to select the third block, and this one here I'll use the date picker input. label, date of your expense. Again, this is not an optional field, so no. Parameter, put that as date. And I'm again going to leave all of the other fields as it is. Again, what you'll see is there isn't any option for us to perform any validation on this requirement that we have. So we'll explore how to do that later on. For now, let's just go ahead to actually test whether all of these work. See, I have several other sections that I have to also populate with. So let me just go ahead to select all of the optional fields so that we can see everything that we can actually configure for. Submit view is also one which I'll have to actually configure. Over here, since we are actually collecting several inputs, this section here is required that we have to actually hook it up to another recipe, collect all of these parameters that we have just specified in the fields above. Again, I'm going to make this a recursive design. So instead of selecting from another recipe over here, I'm going to toggle enter a custom value instead. And going back up into my properties, I'll use recipe ID. Right. And then I'm just going to customize several other fields for submit button. Let's just label it as create expense. If it's closed, let's say cancel. And then we can keep the rest of the options as default values. For now, let's go ahead and test whatever we have just built up for these first 4 actions. Let me just remove it. Alright, so I'm just going to start the recipe. And let's go back into Slack. So we're just going to go into our bot, which is Bumblebee, and invoke the command that we have just created. So that will be create new expense. What you'll see over here is my first if condition. The trigger ID is not present in this text message, so it's coming back to populate for me a button, which I can click on to generate the trigger ID, which then allows me to open this modal view. What you'll see in here are my 3 input fields for my description, amount, and date. So let's try submitting some of these parameters. I'm just going to put in description. This is a test. And what you see over here is if I actually put in lesser than 5 characters, Slack allows me to perform that length validation which we have just done, right? I'm going to populate something that's longer than 5 characters. Amount, let's put it to maybe $10, right? And then for my date, I'm going to choose from the date picker option over here. Let's put it to yesterday. Right, go ahead to create an expense. What you see in here is that once I actually click on create an expense, just because we are using a recursive sort of a strategy, then it's going to come back into the same recipe. The button over here, the form submission button over here, gives me another trigger ID, which then opens another modal that you see over here. So to stop that from happening, let's go back into our recipe first. Just going to take a look at what the job reports gives us in our recipe. So there are 3 jobs over here that were populated, and these 3 are actually 3 different actions that we have just done. Over here, the first one is when we actually submitted the command for creating a new expense. That was the first job. The second was when we clicked on the button, and the third was when we submitted the modal form itself. That's why we have 3. Let's take a look at the last one over here. And then if I go down into the trigger, let's take a look at what the outputs are for when a modal is submitted. Over here inside of the context, what you'll see is modals. And there is a section that tells me whether or not this modal is submitted. And that is where I can see the view submission portion. That is true. Let's also compare this section that we see over here to the previous jobs itself. The first one being when we invoke the command via a text message. That contains the context over here, but it doesn't include the modal section. And the second Over here, this trigger output again, what it provides me with are other information. It doesn't give me any information about whether the modal is submitted or not. So that's one item that we can potentially use to actually identify if whenever we are recursing in this recipe, whether or not the modal is submitted. If it is, we don't actually want to open the same modal view again. So let's go ahead to make some modifications. Coming here to stop the recipe, what we're going to do in this section under the else portion is we're going to again perform another if else condition. Over here, I'm going to set it up such that if the modal view submission portion is not true, then we would like to open the modal view. So let me go ahead and put that up here and set up my condition. The data field that I'll be using is inside the trigger output under step 1, under the context section. If I scroll down, there is going to be a modals portion here, and I can see 4 fields over here that I could potentially use. Now let's again go back into the job report that we were previously looking at to identify the right field that we want. Over here, trigger output, context, modals. This is the one that we are looking for, whether or not view submission is set to true. However, if I come back in here, what I can see is that this portion for view submission is not something that's populated from within here. But that's fine, because we can also use other formulas to access a field that a job report provides you with. If I come into the context section, if you recall in the previous jobs itself, this modals section was not present. We would like to first of all validate if this portion is present, and then we'll actually look for the view submission key inside of it. I'm just going to come back in here for my data field. I'm going to toggle this to a formula mode, and I'm going to check if modals is present. If the modal is present, we're just going to add another condition, and we're going to check for the views submission portion as well. So that will come under formula mode again. We're going to access this, and since we don't have a data field for it, I'm just going to actually take this and copy this portion, and let's access it with a formula over here. So this one allows us to access the value, and over here what we are doing is check whether or not this portion is true. So that's how we set up the if condition. If these criteria are met, or we actually don't want to open the modal, that goes under the else block instead. Rather, what we want to do in here, go down, and let's just post a reply back to the user for now to say that we have received your expense form itself. We'll go ahead to process it. I'm just going to come in here, put a post command reply. Let's just put a simple message text. Received your expense. Let's go back up and let's clean this up a bit. Let's remove the empty blocks that we don't want to use for now. So let's take a look at how this looks like when we go into Slack. I'm just going to restart the process here. Create new expense. Go ahead and click on the button. Let's put our test 2. $5 this time around. Okay, create my expense. And over here, the modal closes this time around, and it says that I've received your expense. Right. What it has not done yet is if we go back into our requirements, is we have not actually checked whether or not these two field values are according to the requirements that we have. So if we come back into our recipe, first of all, let's take a look at the job reports for the expense form that we've just submitted. Let's just go ahead and refresh the page over here. And let's take a look at the latest one. So let's open up the trigger and the output section. Go into context and modals. You can see here that the view submission portion is now set as true. And if I actually open up the parameters section over here, you'll see that this one isn't actually populated yet. However, it is actually present inside of my parameter string, the values that I've just submitted. There is the description, there is the amount, and there is my date. Collect all of these parameters over here. Let's go back and modify our recipe to add that as input values. I'm just going to stop the recipe again, going to my trigger, coming down into the command input fields section. We're just going to define the three sort of fields that we have previously defined in the blocks below. So if I actually go all the way down into my modal view, again, what we need to collect are the three blocks of inputs that we were collecting. We need to actually match the same description under the parameter name section, amount, and finally we also have the date. So let's re-add three of these as our input fields. Just because we are using a recursive technique over here, this trigger needs to collect those information as well. Add a command input, description, and there are a couple of configurations that we need to change over here from the default values so that it will actually work well with our recursive techniques. For a start, we'll have to change the optional portion to yes instead, and once I do that, I will also not want to prompt the user for this input at this level here. Where this will be done instead is that it will be happening on the modal level instead later on. So just going to add the next two fields, one for amount, again doing the same over here, optional setting as yes, prompting users no. The last one for the date, data type, just going to change that into a date type instead, and optional, this is yes, prompting no. Right, so that's what we have so far for description, amount, and date. What we can do now is we'll be able to see this from our step output for step 1. If I minimize context, you'll see these three fields appearing under the parameters section this time round. So what happens over later on is I'll be able to use some of these data fields down under my portion over here. Whenever the modal is submitted, those three fields that we have just defined will be accessible from within this portion here. So before I even post the command reply that we have received your response, let's do a couple of validations. To do so, I'm just going to add several if conditions to actually check for the three requirements that we have specified. We can actually leave these out for now, just because we already have this requirement set at the modal level for the minimum number of characters. What we can do is let's validate on the amount field instead. So if I come back into my recipe, let's set up my condition. And over here, if I go back into step 1 output, let's scroll down into the parameters section. Amount field is something that I can use to craft out my if conditions. So here is the requirement, integer or float. Let's take a look at what are possible values that a user can actually put into this field. So if I go back into Bumblebee, rate and expense, you'll see this portion is pretty much a free text field. That means to say I can put a valid amount, I can put an invalid amount in that form as well, right? And it can be all characters, and it's still going to be a valid field that I could potentially submit over here. Just go back and modify this portion. Let's set up my condition. Coming into the step 1 output, let's go down into amount, and here, so we are going to do some regular expressions to validate the amount field. So let's look for one that we can potentially use. Let's search Google for it. Here's one that I found previously. This one is on Stack Overflow. Let's take a look. This is pretty much what our requirements are, right? Perform a simple regular expression for a decimal with a precision of 2 for amount values. And over here, these are some valid examples that we would like to allow a user to apply an amount value for, and these are invalid examples. Let's go down into the answers section, and someone has mentioned that this is a potential sort of regular expression that I can use. I'm just going to test this out over here on redxr.com, and we'll try this portion in this expression tester part view. I'm just going to put in several values, right? So this is 1050. This is a valid one, just because it's highlighted over. If I put 1050A, you'll see that this portion is valid, but this isn't, right? So what we'll need to do is, let's also match the entire string on this expression. Just going to use some anchors in here, pretty much the character over here to indicate the start of the string, and the $sign at the end to indicate the end of the string. So this expression says that this portion is not a match just because we have the offending character A over here, but if I were to actually remove that portion, you'll see that this is now one match, right? Likewise, if I were to actually go ahead to test with several other kinds of examples, let's say if a 3 decimal place, this one isn't available. If it's 1, that's fine. And then if it's just a whole number on its own, that is fine as well, right? ABC, this one is not a match. It seems like this is a regular expression that we can potentially use. I'm just going to copy this and come back into our recipe. We actually toggle on the formula mode over here to test the amount string that the user has supplied with the regular expression that we have just created. So we're going to use the match formula, whether the string contains the pattern, and where I can specify it is between these two slashes itself. So I'm going to paste that in, and we're going to say that if this is not true, then it means that this is an invalid amount, which we'll like to flag it up as an error to the user. So we'll perform an action here later on to actually flag it up as an error. But before I do that, I'm just going to actually set up the second condition as well. Going into my fences, I also have this as my requirement for the date having to be greater or equal to the first day of the last month. So I'm just going to set up the condition for that as well first. So coming in here, let's add one more. If condition in my data field, set one output. I'm going to go down into the parameters section once again. I have my date over here. And this is where we would like to set it to greater than. And then we would like it to be greater than the first day or of the last month, right? So that's where I can go into my formula. I can go ahead to craft one out. A minus 1.months to get the last month. And then what I will probably want to get from that is the first day of the month itself. So let's see, the beginning of month. Yeah, that is the formula that we would like to use to get the first day of the last month. What you see over here is that the condition is greater than. So we were actually looking for less than rather. Let me just change that. And so if the date is less than first day of the last month, then this is an error again. So again, in steps 7 and 9 are areas that we would like to flag it up to the user. Now, if I come back into my requirements, one of the key requirements for providing a good user experience in here is to actually surface all input errors to the user upon submission. So that's where I want to actually come into my recipe to collect whether or not 6 itself had an error or 8 itself had an error. So to do so, I'm just going to actually populate with a list of errors to collect so that I can show all of that to the user at once. So coming in here, I'm going to actually go into list. I'm going to use the variables option, and we'll initialize a list from here. I'm going to create a list. Again, to remove the suggestions, just going to name my list as form errors, and I'm going to give a list of error messages in here. Errors, error. And for each of these if conditions, if it evaluated inside, which means that an error occurred for that validation portion, I'm going to flag it up with by adding it to the list. So coming in here, let's add item to list. Let's choose form errors. And then we'll add the error message in here. This one is for amount, not matching the required format in here. So let's give the user an appropriate error message. Integer or float to this. To 1 or 2 decimal places. So that's the first. And then for the next, let's clone this. Let's just move this down in here, adding another error. This is for the date. Date events go to first day of the last month. So these are my 2 errors that I've collected, and I'm ready to actually send these off to the user itself. So what we want to do in here is let's just remove the command reply portion. We don't need this just yet. Instead, what I'll be doing is coming down and revisiting the open modal portion that we have just created previously. Previously, this section would only go in if we are clicking on the button for the first time to open that modal view. However, what we also like to do in here is that we want to be able to open that modal view if it's clicked for the first time, or if there were errors inside of steps 8 and 10, and we would like to update the same modal with the error messages as well. So to do so, what I'm going to be doing is we're just going to be moving this out of the else block. Over here, we're going to create another if condition, and we're going to move the modals portion in here. To set up the condition is when we'll actually check if there were any errors from within here, or the modal is being opened for the first time. To do so, I'm just going to introduce a couple of variables to keep track of where we are. Over here on step 4, this is where we, first of all, if we enter into this branch, we would either want to actually open up a new modal or to update the existing modal. I'm just going to create an action for a variable. I'm going to click on create a new variable, again to remove the sections over here. But I want to name this variable as modal action type. Right. And the default, it's going to be open. Right. It's going to either only have a value of open or to perform an update if it enters this branch over here on step 6, when the view submission portion is set to true. I'm just coming in here to actually update the variable on step 7. Use variables, update, modal action type, and this value here is going to be updated. So these are my 2 branches, and then if I come down all the way to the bottom, if the modal action type here remains as open, then I want to perform this. Or another way to actually also perform this is if we entered into this branch where the modal action type is set to update, but there were errors like step number 10 or number 12. I'm just going to set that condition up over here, modal action type equals to open, or there were errors inside of the existing submission. So coming in here, step 8 output, form errors. When you use this data view, toggle it to formula mode. The condition is present. Right. So once that is done, we want to come into our modal view, and there are 2 scenarios over here. So we need to update the existing modal with the 2 scenarios. First of all, the existing modal action type, we either want to perform an open or an update. Previously, we have already created a variable just to determine what this type should be. So I'm just going to toggle it to an enter a custom value portion instead. So I've already created that value. I'm going to use this one over here. The rest of the portions, we can leave it as it is. But what I want to do is, if we entered into the update modal portion, what I would like to actually do is to actually surface some of these error messages up to the user. So how I can do that is by creating yet another block to actually surface those error messages that we have just collected. And we are just going to create another block this time round to show list of error messages if that were to actually have occurred. So coming into block 4, the type of block I'm going to be using in this case, it is going to be my repeat block group. And I'm going to actually just choose from this portion in here. The type of block is context block. And we'll see how we can populate the error messages in this section here. I'm going to first of all have to define my source list for whichever I'm repeating over. And this is going to come from my step 8, which contains all of my form errors. I'm just going to put that in the repeats list. And the blocks in here, the context information, I'm going to add an element. That's going to be my text element. And it's just simply going to be the error message that we are repeating over. Once all of that is done, let's just minimize all of this so that we can take a look at whatever we have just defined so far. We have our first 3 blocks, which are our inputs, and then we have the 4th block, which contains the error messages if that were to occur. What I'm going to do is just to rearrange this such that the error messages are at the top of the blocks. So I'm just going to move that all the way to the top. Right, so once that is done, if I open this again, the first block is now my repeat block with all of the error messages if that exists. Right. So once we are done, let's go ahead to delete the section, clean it up our recipe, and let's test whatever we have created so far. Just go ahead to start your recipe. Coming back into Slack, going into Bumblebee. And then I'm going to try the create expense button again. Just going to restart the command. Create my expense. This is my test 3. My amount now. Let's put an invalid amount now, right? Just see if our validation has worked. And then I'm just going to put a validate. Once we clicked on create an expense, what happens next is that recipe was performing its own validations. It recognized that it was an expense submission, and then it went to actually validate all of the fields that we have just submitted. In this case, the amount field was wrong, and that's why we see the error message over here. The amount field needs to be either an integer or a float to 1 or 2 decimal places. So that's good. We have the first set of validation. Let's test one more validation, whereby we want to put an invalid amount, and we also want to put an invalid date. Let's just put maybe 1st of January. Go ahead to create our expense. And it comes back this time around with 2 error messages, right? The amount field needs to either be an integer or float again. And this time around, it also says that the date of expense has to be greater or equals to the first day of last month. So that's our error validation in action. What I can see over here is that the context information here isn't really stand out for now. It's in gray. We probably want to give more attention to this section. So let's go ahead to customize formatting in here. For example, I would like to actually highlight that this is the amount and this is the date. And let's maybe put in a couple of emojis just to make this more stand out. To do so, what I can do is let's go into our emojis. Let's see, this one here seems good. This is a warning emoji. I'm going to copy this section here. And let's come back here and make our modifications. So going to my recipe. Under the open or push modal view action. Again, going back into our first block, which is the repeat context blocks for all of our errors. I'm going to go into the text section. Let's first of all paste a warning to this error. Right. Next is where I also want to highlight the specific field as red. If I come back up into the add item form errors list, you'll see here I format this with backticks so that it becomes a red field inside of Slack. So we're going to do the same for the date portion as well. Go ahead to start it. And let's see how it appears this time around. So let's create another expense. Let's do our test 4, 5 AB, date of expense. So we'll have just one invalid field first with our expense. You'll see over here, this time around, this is now better formatted. Right? The amount field needs to be either an integer or float. And then if I go ahead and fix that, test 5, okay, I'll give you an integer value. But maybe for the date, let me just try an invalid one. Go ahead to create my expense, and now it says that this is the second kind of error. So we have already completed one of the requirements to actually surface up all of the error messages from within this modal. However, there is also one more requirement that we should keep the progress of whatever the user has previously filled out, right? So let's go back into our recipe to address these three fields itself. So if I come back in here, let's stop the recipe again. Let's make some modifications. We know that the inputs are provided for us in this section, description, amount, and date. When we go ahead to actually validate all of these fields, this is where the values are appearing. So what we can do potentially is coming back into the open modal section, we can go in down and take a look at the blocks that were collecting all of our inputs. First of all, I have my description field over here. What I can see is that there is an option for me to set what the default value is. So this is where I can potentially use trigger output, going down into the parameters section and putting in the description as my default value over here. If in other scenarios, the description portion is not populated, for example, when we click on the button to open the modal for the first time, this would just be blank and the portion would just be empty. In subsequent submissions, when it's being validated, that is going to recurse and come back in here to actually keep the user progress. So I'm just going to do the same for the two other fields, going down into the amount, default value, put the amount here, and finally we also have one for the initial date over here as well. So let's go ahead to start the recipe again, see whether or not we have completed this requirement. Let's go ahead to create our new expense, create an expense. Oops, looks like we have an invalid value over here. So let's take a look at how we can fix this. Right, there was an invalid argument. To match all the allowed schemas, the input must be a valid date. So let's take a look at the job reports to troubleshoot this. So let's take a look at the error. And if I go down all the way into this portion, trying to open the modal caused me an error itself. So let's take a look at the input, going to the view, going into the blocks. This is probably for the date field. So over here, we have our date picker input. And the initial date over here, when we are first opening the expense portion, it seems like we cannot simply specify an empty string. For the other scenarios, for example, for the description, it accepted an initial value of an empty string, same for amount, but date needs a proper value instead. So to fix this, we're just going to actually go back into our recipe and make a slight modification to this initial date. So if I come back down in here, open the modal view, I'm going to try first of all my formula. I'm going to say if this one, if it's present, or skip this entirely. So this one over here allows me to return the value it says present. If it's new, it's going to evaluate this portion instead. skip this field. So let's test out whether or not that works. Go ahead to start the recipe. I'm back in here. Let's try creating an expense once again. Over here, now you can see that this portion is now working again. Let's perform our test 6. Let's give an invalid amount. Let's also choose a date. Try creating an expense. Oops, this time around again you see that there is an invalid date. So let's go back and fix this portion this time around. So coming in here, let's just refresh the page. Going to take a look at the latest job report. This is the input must be a valid date. So let's take a look what the input is for the blocks portion. Date. Oh, it seems like this is being formatted as a date and time object instead of a date field that we want instead. So to fix this, let's go back into our recipe. Let's stop the recipe once again. Let's fix this first of all by coming into the trigger. Let's go in here. Over here, we don't actually want time, we want just date. So let's save this. It seems like it's not giving us the portion over here. Let's fix this from within the schema over here, changing the type to date. So it seems like this field over here cannot be simply set as a date type. If that's the case, what I'm going to be doing is let's change this into a string instead to fix that entirely. So let's see again if I were to start the recipe, whether or not that works. Let's go ahead and create our expense. Test 7 this time around. Amount 105A. Date. 4th of May. Let's try it. Creating our expense. This time around there is another error. So let's take a look. So I'm going to go into the job report. There is a miscellaneous error. Over here, we are trying to perform some date formulas, calculating the date, whether or not it's less than the value over here. So in order to actually parse this as a date from a string, what we'll need to do is go back into our recipe. Let's stop it first. Then coming in here to the if condition, I'm going to have to actually parse this as a date. But before I do that, going back into the job report again, opening that up, let's take a look at the format of the date that Slack provides us with. So if I come into the output, you can see over here for the parameters section, the date is going to be in the format of year dash month dash date. So I'm going to actually use that when formatting the date over here. So we are going to toggle this into a formula mode using the toDate portion. Just going to tell what the format is. And there we go, we have converted into a date object so that we can perform a check whether or not it's less than this calculated value. I'm just going to hit start the recipe. And let's test it one more time. Going here to create my expense. Test it. 105, 104A. Give it 4th of May. Yep. This time around, the date portion is working. You can see that also all the field values are being kept where the user last created the expense for. And over here, there is my error message that the amount field needs to be an integer. So I can go ahead and fix that. In the meantime, I can also change this portion. Let's make it an invalid one. 4th of March. Create the expense. You can see that the error message changes over here. All of the values are kept. And I can fix this once again. Create my expense. Finally, when I submit it, this is where no message appears just yet, just because we have not handled the form submission. But that indicates to us that all of the fields are being validated and the dialog box, or rather the modal, doesn't appear anymore. So let's go into the final part of our recipe to actually handle what we should do when the form is submitted successfully. So coming in here, let's refresh the page one more time. Let's just take a look at what we have in our job report. You can open this. We just have a lot of tabs open right now, so I'm just going to clean some of these up. So this is our latest job report. Coming into the trigger, let's take a look at the output. What we can see over here are our 3 valid parameters. And if I scroll down into the recipe actions, what you'll see in here is that it went into the views submission branch. It told that the modal action type was an update. However, while checking for the errors portion, it did not meet any of that, so there were no errors inside here, which did not reopen up your modal. So what we can do now is we can go into this portion, we can go into the recipe, stop it, and we can now create our next set of actions, right? If it entered this branch, it means to open the new modal, but if it did not, then we can now proceed on with all of the valid fields, carry on with our actual business process. So to do so, what I have currently for this section, unfortunately, is just an if condition. What I need to do instead is convert this into an if else. So to do so, I have to recreate the if condition with the if else portion. I'm going to set up the conditions again, just like how we see in step 14. So if the modal action equals to open, just going to do that here. Equals open. And, or the form errors is present. Another condition for form errors, formula, form errors is present. Then we want to be able to update, or rather open or update the modal. So let's just go here and remove this if condition that we don't need anymore. We can clean this section up as well. Otherwise, this is where in the else section is where we can now carry out all of our proper business processes, right? I'm just going to give comment for this section. All fields are now validated. Proceed. So for now, at least, what we will do is let's just go back into Workbot and let's just post a command reply to indicate to the user that all is going well. I'm going to come down in here. Let's just give a message text. I'm going to say your form has been validated. We'll now process your expense. Right. And then this is where later on you can also go ahead and create all of your other kinds of actions just in order so you can handle all of this business process from within here. For now, let's just go ahead to start the recipe once again, and let's see the entire end-to-end flow, starting from a user invoking the command for create new expense, clicking on the button, go for test 7, the amount, say this is $12.54, but an invalid one, date, put it 4th of May. Right, so now you see the amount is invalid. If I go ahead and fix that, create my expense, you can see that now my form has been validated and we are now processing your expense. So in this demo, what you have seen is we have just created one single recipe that uses a recursive sort of technique. Over here on step 3, posting that button, once a user clicks on that, coming back into the trigger at the top, and then going ahead to process the new modal actions over here with creating your modal for the first time if you are clicking on the button, or performing additional validations between steps 7 to 12 if a user is submitting the expense form. Once all of that is done, it then comes into step 17, where we can now proceed on with our other business processes. So I hope you found this useful. With the use of Slack's modal functionalities, you can actually create these complex field validations as we have done so over here, right, on the amount and date portion. And when you have more fields in the future, what you can potentially do is add several other if conditions, perform those validations as well. All right, thank you for watching.